This is the Destiny Well Lab Interpretation Guide for the blood sugar profile. At Destiny Well, we define laboratory ranges in a sophisticated way. We use the standard ranges, represented by the blue bar here, from each reference lab that does a particular test to define the lab high and the lab low. If you have thyroid test results that are too low based on the lab's formal norm, then you have a diagnosis of lab low thyroid function or hypothyroidism. Similarly, for glucose, if you have a lab high blood sugar of over 126 on 2 occasions, then you meet the formal diagnosis criteria for diabetes. That's needed to make a medical diagnosis. But at Destiny Well, we think that there can be a lot more nuance. We believe that there's often an optimal range based on what we've found going forward helps people to live the healthiest lives, to be the healthiest, and to avoid disease. We triangulate this with the medical literature, with other people's standards, with our clinical practice experience, and all the different data points we can get, so we can come up with what we believe is optimal for a particular test result. Destiny Well also, in the red bars here, will define a Destiny Well high and a Destiny Well low. These may or may not line up exactly with a laboratory high or low, because sometimes we think that the range can be higher or lower, or that it needs to be different. And in between the optimal and the green bar, and the low and the high in the red bars, we have orange zones for moderately high and moderately low. They're not quite optimal, but they're not in the high or low zone. Insulin resistance is a key root cause risk factor. Now we know that insulin resistance increases cardiovascular disease risk, increases risk of things like Alzheimer's disease, and also for small blood vessel problems that cause things like erectile dysfunction, not to mention diabetes and prediabetes, and it's also associated with hypertension, all silent and visible killers. But did you know that it also affects your hormone metabolism? When you're resistant to insulin in men, you have a tendency to build up VAT or visceral adipose tissue, that fat around the middle that causes changes in metabolism. It changes your hormone metabolism by activating an enzyme called aromatase that turns testosterone into estrogen. That changes your emotions and also builds up things like breast tissue in men. In women, insulin resistance activates the lyase pathways and leads to more production of androgen or testosterone type hormones, increasing acne, increasing body hair, changing voice, and other undesirable effects. With the evolving knowledge of lipids, it's important to know things like particle sizes. And so we think that we have a test that shows these in our advanced cardiovascular profile by measuring them directly, but we also check these indirectly by measuring things like the HDL to triglyceride ratio that gives us an indicator of what your particle sizes will likely be. Another great thing about the cardiovascular and blood sugar profile from Destiny Well is it puts you back in charge. Your insurance company might say if your cholesterol is normal, you only need to check it every 5 years. But if you've made a lot of progress, you've been dieting, you've lost weight, you've started a new exercise regimen, or you've fallen off the wagon and you want to know where you are, this puts the power back with you. You can check it as often as you like. When people develop insulin resistance, that often leads to metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a condition that's said to be present when you have 3 of these 5 things present. You have elevated triglycerides, you have elevated blood pressure, you have increased fat around the middle, which shows up with increased waist circumference, also called increased visceral adipose tissue, because it not only shows up in the belly on the outside, but it's in the inside of the abdomen and also around the heart. Elevated blood sugar is another factor, and then decreased HDL good cholesterol, values less than 40 in men and less than 50 in women. Any 3 or more of those give you a situation where you have metabolic syndrome. Hemoglobin A1C, or glycohemoglobin, is a critical blood sugar test. It was invented a number of years ago, and since then, diabetes care has been revolutionized. It measures how many sugar molecules are stuck onto the hemoglobin in red blood cells. And sugar molecules get stuck onto all sorts of proteins and cause glycation or damage to those molecules. So we can measure and get an average of what's going on with the blood sugar for about 3 months. Because typically red blood cells live for about 3 months and then they're recycled for parts. So if you measure how much sugar is stuck onto the hemoglobin molecules, it gives you this 3-month average. Now, if you're in a highly stressful situation or you have abnormal red blood cells or you have a lot of oxidation in your blood, then red cells don't live as long, and so you're getting maybe a 2-month average of that. But overall, we say this is a 3-month blood sugar test, and there are different ranges. So lab normal for us is 4 to 6% from the reference laboratory we're using. And we think that an optimal value is somewhere in the range of 4.6 to 4.9. As you get down to 4.2 to 4.5, you may be running your sugar a little bit low. Now that decreases cardiovascular risk, but when you have a sugar in that low range, you may be using more cortisol all the time to keep it there. And sustained high levels of cortisol in the 4.2 to 4.5, or even in the lower range of 4 to 4.2, high levels of cortisol can disrupt your normal bowel flora. They can shrink key areas in the brain like the hippocampus and lead to adrenal exhaustion and dysfunction of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the thing that regulates your cortisol and a number of your other hormones, as well as your day-night cycles. Now, elevated glycohemoglobin, 5 to 5.6, is considered abnormal, and over 5.7 is Destiny well high. Now, getting up above 6 is definitely in the lab high range. It's important to know that our ranges for both glycohemoglobin and fasting blood sugar are for non-diabetics. People with diabetes, especially those who take insulin or other medicines that significantly lower their blood sugar, are at increased risk of hypoglycemia when they have things that drive their sugar down. So if they run their glycohemoglobin or their fasting sugar in very low ranges, then they're at risk for hypoglycemia, which can lead to coma and death. And so often we build in a bit of margin of safety and try not to run the glycohemoglobin and the sugar as low with people who actually have diabetes. So if you don't have diabetes or you have prediabetes and you're using diet and exercise and lifestyle modifications, then the targets we list are for you. If you do have diabetes, then you need to work even more closely with your personal physician or medical providers to get those levels in a range that is optimal for you as defined by your care team. Fasting blood sugar has long been a way to evaluate your glucose metabolism. It has to do with your basal insulin secretion, how much insulin you put out overnight to control the blood sugar that is manufactured by your liver and your metabolism all the time. Our laboratory partner calls their reference range 60 on the low side and 105 on the high side. At Destiny Well, we call low anything less than 70, and we think the optimal green zone is between 80 and 93. When you get below 80, you don't have frank hypoglycemia where you go into insulin shock and coma, but you do get edgy or hangry where you're hungry and angry at the same time. Your performance may be suboptimal, and you may also be relying on high levels of cortisol to maintain your blood sugar all the time. If you have continued high levels of cortisol, it does a number of things. It disrupts your circadian rhythm. It leads to exhaustion and imbalance of what's called HPA, or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That's the communication between the area in the brain called the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland in the brain, and the adrenal gland that controls your stress hormones. If that cortisol level is too high all the time, then it may shrink your hippocampus, which is a memory area. It may disrupt your circadian rhythms, and it may lead to a number of other problems. And if your sugar is mildly high at 93 to 100, you're getting close to prediabetes, and your average glycohemoglobin is probably a little higher, and you're sticking more glucose molecules onto proteins and damaging them. And when you get over 100, you're into prediabetes. These are all values if you've been fasting for 8 hours or more, and they have to do with the diagnosis of insulin resistance, of prediabetes, and diabetes. When you take a fasting blood sugar after you've not eaten for 8 hours or more, that represents your basal insulin secretion. The basal is the amount that you put out all the time, so how much insulin you're putting out overnight to control the sugar that your liver is making. The amount that you put out overnight and steadily through the day is your basal insulin secretion. The hemoglobin A1C test is the average over time. It's the area under the curve that represents how high your sugar is through the day in response to food and in between meals. When your fasting blood sugar is up, but your glycohemoglobin A1C is normal, that means you have a low basal insulin secretion, so overnight it's not quite sufficient to keep your sugar completely normal. But when you eat, there's a good food-stimulated insulin response, so your sugar goes down and stays down, and the area under the curve is lower. Sometimes that also happens if you're eating a low glycemic diet or fasting a lot. Then through the day, your insulin doesn't have much need to be up and your sugar is okay. If, on the other hand, your fasting blood sugar is normal and your A1C is up, that means you have a good basal insulin response. Your sugars are normal overnight, but when you eat, you have an insufficient insulin response to meals and possibly a steady high glycemic diet. So when you eat, your sugar goes up longer and it stays up longer, and the area under the curve, the A1C, is higher. When we think of regulation of blood sugar, we think of insulin. Insulin is a key factor in keeping blood sugar from getting too high, but it also helps insulin get into the cells where it can be used. However, other hormones are interrelated and closely regulate blood sugar as well. Cortisol, for instance, tells the body to make sugar and make sure there's plenty of it around all the time. And when cortisol starts to fail, or in emergency situations, then hormones like adrenaline and noradrenaline come into play. They also raise heart rate and blood pressure, but they do raise the sugar as well. Sugar is a vital fuel for cells. Most cells, especially the brain and the heart, need sugar to run on. They can learn to metabolize lipids more effectively and burn them as well, but sugar on a day-to-day basis for most of us runs the system. In functional medicine, we call insulin resistance type 3 diabetes. When there's enough sugar, but it can't get into the cells, this can lead to cognitive decline of the Alzheimer's type. Sugar also affects hormone metabolism. When we get insulin resistance, we get visceral adipose tissue around the middle. That leads to an increase in the enzyme called aromatase. In men, aromatase converts testosterone to estrogen, which leads to increased breast tissue and other changes. And in women, increased aromatase leads to higher levels of estrogen. Now, those higher levels prevent women from getting osteoporosis as much, but it comes at an expense because higher estrogen levels, especially if they're unopposed by progesterone hormone, and that there's not enough of that around, they get more breast cancer and uterine cancer risk. So all these hormones are interrelated. We think of insulin, but cortisol and catecholamines and even the sex steroids all relate to sugar metabolism. Tests included in the Destiny Well blood sugar profile include the fasting blood sugar and the glycohemoglobin, or hemoglobin A1C test. The combination of these two tests is great because it gives you a look at both the way your body handles sugar overnight, representing your basal insulin secretion, and how you handle sugar all the time. And it gives you a long-term 2 to 3 month average of your sugar, which represents the sum total of day and night, including how your body handles surges of food, so how high your sugar goes and how long it takes to go down after you've eaten. At Destiny Well, we've been extremely fortunate to find some amazingly good coaches, people with backgrounds of success in varied fields who bring all sorts of resources and talent and skill to help you. These folks have many years of clinical experience, and they know how to be of assistance at every step of the way, from motivation to connecting you with the right resources to finding things that you need to get you on your journey. To learn more, go to destinywell.com/coaching to meet our team and find out how they can be of service to you.